They were comfortable when they thought they understood you. Now they don't, and that's what unsettles them. Avoidance feels safest inside patterns. Predictability isn't boring to them, it's regulating. When your responses were consistent, when your emotions were readable, when your availability felt guaranteed, they knew how to position themselves. They knew when to pull back and when to reappear. They knew how much effort was required to keep the connection without feeling overwhelmed by it. In their nervous system, that wasn't manipulation, it was safety. And for a long time, you fit that pattern. You showed up the same way. You explained your feelings clearly. You reacted when distance appeared. You tried to repair tension quickly. From the outside, that looked like emotional maturity. But to an avoidant, it also meant something else. You were emotionally trackable. They could anticipate your reactions. They could predict your patience. They could assume you're invested in something shifted. Not in a dramatic way, not through ultimatums or emotional explosions. The shift was subtle, and that's why it caught them off guard. You stopped reacting the same way. The long explanations faded. The need to clarify yourself softened. You didn't disappear, but you didn't overextend either. You stopped trying to manage their comfort for them. That's when the internal alarm goes off for an avoidant, because suddenly they can't read you the way they used to. The old emotional map no longer works. Where they expected reassurance, there's calm. Where they expected urgency, there's space. Where they expected you to reach, you pause instead. And that pause feels unfamiliar. Not because it's cold, but because it's grounded. This is where people misunderstand what's happening. You didn't become distant. You didn't become manipulative. You didn't become unpredictable in emotion. You became unpredictable in strength. Your energy stopped leaking outward. Your sense of self stopped orbiting their behavior. You began responding instead of reacting. And to an avoidant, that shift feels destabilizing because it removes their sense of orientation. Here's the part most people miss. Avoidants aren't seeking power over you. They're seeking relief from internal overwhelm. Control isn't about dominance. It's about preventing closeness from getting too intense, too fast, too exposing. When they know how someone will respond, they can regulate how close things get. But when they can't predict you anymore, they feel exposed. Your growth forces them to confront something uncomfortable, that the connection was safer for them when you were more emotionally available than they were, when you were the one bridging gaps, when you were the one making things smooth. Your consistency buffered their avoidance. Now that buffer is gone. And what replaces it isn't chaos, it's clarity. You're no longer bending to keep the bond intact. You're no longer filling emotional silence automatically. You're allowing space to exist without rushing to resolve it. And that space makes them aware of something they've avoided for a long time, their own emotional limitations. That's why this shift matters so deeply. It's not that they suddenly fear losing you, it's that they realize they no longer understand you in the old way. And for someone who survives through predictability, that loss of understanding feels like losing footing on solid ground. This is the moment an avoidant begins to feel unsettled, not because you changed who you are, but because you finally stopped shrinking yourself to stay familiar. Control was never about power. It was about safety. And when you stepped into your own stability, you unknowingly stepped out of the role that kept them comfortable. That's the shift they didn't see coming. They can handle tears. They can handle emotional intensity. They can even handle conflict. What they can't handle is your calm. Avoidants are neurologically conditioned to expect emotional spikes when closeness feels threatened. Raised voices, long messages, repeated explanations, visible distress. Those reactions are familiar. They confirm an internal belief. Emotion leads to pressure, and pressure justifies distance. When emotions rise, an avoidant knows exactly what to do. Pull back, shut down, create space. The system works. They feel regulated again. This is why emotional reactions, even painful ones, don't scare them the way people assume. Tears still keep the pattern intact. Urgency still places you in pursuit. Intensity still orbits their behavior. From their perspective, nothing has fundamentally changed. They still have a predictable role. But calm disrupts everything. When you respond with grounded composure instead of emotional urgency, their internal script breaks. There's no spike to react to, no emotional surge to retreat from, no pressure that gives them a reason to create distance. Your calm removes the justification their nervous system relies on to stay disengaged. And that's deeply unsettling. Your calm doesn't say, I don't care. It says, I'm stable. It signals that you're not chasing reassurance, that your emotional center isn't destabilized by their withdrawal, that your sense of self isn't dependent on their availability. And this is where the quiet fear emerges. Not panic, not drama, but a subtle internal question they don't know how to answer. If they're okay without me, what does that say about my role? For someone who has learned to maintain connection through distance, your calm introduces uncertainty. The old leverage disappears. They can no longer assume you'll reach when they pull. They can no longer predict that silence will provoke emotion. They can no longer rely on intensity to reset the dynamic. And that lack of reaction feels more threatening than any emotional outburst ever could, because calm implies choice. It implies that you're not being held in the connection by anxiety or attachment alone. It suggests that you're present because you want to be, not because you need to be. And for an avoidant, that distinction is if you don't need them to regulate yourself, then their distance loses its power. This is why calm often triggers internal activation and avoidance. They may become restless, curious, slightly uneasy, not because you're doing something wrong, but because your regulation highlights their lack of it. Your calm mirrors the emotional maturity they've postponed developing, and mirrors are uncomfortable when you're not ready to look. It's important to understand your calm is not a strategy. It's not silence as manipulation. It's not restraint as punishment. When calm is real, it comes from integration, from no longer needing to manage someone else's emotions to feel secure yourself. That's what makes it powerful. You're no longer broadcasting distress to be seen. You're no longer escalating to maintain connection. You're no longer trying to prove how much you care through emotional labor. And without those signals, the avoidant can't orient themselves the way they used to. Your emotional regulation becomes power, not because you're withholding, but because you're whole. And wholeness is unpredictable to someone who's used to control through distance. In the end, your calm doesn't threaten them because it's cold. It threatens them because it's steady, because it says, I can stay or I can walk, and I'll still be okay. And that truth quietly dismantles the dynamic they depended on to feel safe. They don't know what you'll do next, and that's new for them. Avoidants don't move through connection blindly. On a subconscious level, they are constantly tracking emotional behavior to stay one step ahead of closeness. Not because they're calculating in a malicious way, but because closeness activates threat in their nervous system. Predicting emotional responses helps them regulate that threat. When they know how someone will react, they know how much distance to create, how much effort to offer, and when to re-engage without losing control. For a long time, they could read you. They knew when pulling back would make you lean in. They knew how long silence could last before you reached out. They knew how much warmth was required to keep you hopeful without feeling overwhelmed themselves. These patterns weren't discussed, they were felt, and within those patterns, they felt safe. But now something is different. You don't over-respond anymore. You don't rush to close emotional gaps the moment they appear. You don't send long explanations to repair discomfort. At the same time, you don't disappear in protest or withdraw dramatically to provoke a reaction. You don't swing between extremes. You stay steady. And that steadiness is what makes you unrateable. The old emotional cues are gone. The signals they relied on to predict your behavior no longer appear on schedule. When they pull back, you don't chase, but you also don't punish. When they resurface, you don't flood them with reassurance, but you don't shut them out. Your responses are measured, intentional, and grounded in self-respect rather than fear. This is where the avoidant begins to feel unsettled, because emotional trackability was never about control over you. It was about control over proximity. As long as they could anticipate your reactions, they could manage how close the connection felt. They could regulate intimacy by adjusting distance. But when you stop following the old cycles, that regulation strategy collapses. Now, they don't know what their behavior will produce. Silence doesn't guarantee pursuit. Warmth doesn't guarantee access. Distance doesn't guarantee leverage. And that uncertainty forces awareness. It's important to understand that this unpredictability isn't manipulation. You're not withholding to provoke curiosity. You're not playing hard to get. What's happening is much simpler and much deeper. You outgrew the pattern. You stopped organizing your emotional responses around their attachment style. Growth naturally removes predictability. When someone becomes more self-anchored, their reactions stop being automatic. They pause, they assess, they choose, and choice makes behavior less trackable than reflex ever was. To an avoidant, that shift feels disorienting because it removes the familiar rhythm they depended on. This is also where their leverage disappears. Leverage exists when someone's emotional state is consistently affected by another person's behavior. When pulling away reliably creates longing, there is leverage. When inconsistency reliably creates anxiety, there is leverage. But when someone no longer reacts on cue, the system breaks. You're no longer emotionally tethered to their distance. That doesn't mean you don't care. It means you're no longer predictable in your self-abandonment. And that's the part that changes everything. Because now the avoidant is forced to face the relationship without the advantage of emotional foresight. They can't assume your availability. They can't rely on old dynamics to keep the bond on their terms. They don't know whether you'll stay engaged, step back, or move forward independently. And that uncertainty makes the connection feel real in a way it never did before. You didn't become mysterious. You became sovereign. And when someone can no longer be emotionally tracked, they can no longer be managed. They're not afraid of losing you. They're afraid of what losing you reveals. This is the part most people misunderstand about avoidance. On the surface, it looks like distance means detachment, like they don't care enough to feel the impact of loss. But underneath, avoidance is not the absence of emotion. It's the avoidance of self-awareness. Loss doesn't terrify them because of abandonment alone. It terrifies them because of what it forces them to confront about themselves. When you evolve quietly, you become a mirror they never agreed to look into. You didn't announce your growth. You didn't dramatize your healing. You didn't explain your boundaries in long emotional conversations. You simply started living differently. Your standards shifted. Your tolerance for emotional ambiguity changed. Your energy no longer flowed automatically toward maintaining the connection at all costs. And that quiet evolution reflects something back to them. Your boundaries highlight where they stayed emotionally stagnant, not in a judgmental way, but in contrast. You began showing emotional presence without overextending. You became capable of intimacy without losing yourself. And that contrast exposes the places where they kept intimacy at arm's length, not because they couldn't grow, but because they didn't want to face the discomfort growth requires. Your growth also highlights where they delayed intimacy, where they postponed depth with timing excuses, where they labeled avoidance as independence, where they substituted space for vulnerability. You didn't point this out. You didn't confront them with lists or ultimatums, but your emotional maturity makes delay visible. It becomes obvious when one person is expanding while the other is standing still. And perhaps most confronting of all, your evolution reveals where they relied on distance instead of growth. Distance is easy. It soothes the nervous system without demanding change. Growth, on the other hand, requires emotional risk, self-reflection, and accountability. As long as you were willing to bridge gaps, smooth edges, and wait patiently, they didn't have to choose growth. The relationship could survive on imbalance, but now that imbalance is exposed, not through accusation, through absence. You didn't accuse them of being avoidant. You didn't demand they meet you at your level. You didn't force conversations they weren't ready for. You simply became someone they can't reach the same way anymore. Your presence now requires emotional reciprocity. Your availability assumes self-awareness. Your connection comes with an unspoken truth. I can meet you here, but I won't come back to where you're comfortable staying. And that is deeply destabilizing for an avoidant nervous system because avoidance survives in ambiguity. It thrives when expectations are low and emotional responsibility is blurred. Your clarity removes that fog. It creates a silent question they can't avoid. If this connection no longer works the way it used to, what does that say about me? This is why the fear isn't really about losing you. It's about losing the version of themselves that didn't have to change. Your growth forces a reckoning. It asks them to confront whether distance has protected them or limited them, whether independence has been empowering or isolating, whether their identity has been built around avoiding discomfort rather than moving through it. And those are questions they didn't plan on answering. That's why they may appear unsettled, withdrawn, or even defensive in response to your growth, not because you did something wrong, but because you did something real. You evolved without waiting for permission. You healed without dragging them along. You raised your emotional baseline without making them the villain. You didn't leave them. You outgrew the dynamic that kept them from seeing themselves clearly. And that kind of mirror is impossible to ignore even when they look away. They can't predict whether you'll stay or whether you even need them. For an avoidant, safety and connection isn't created through closeness alone. It's created through certainty. As long as they believe someone is deeply invested, unlikely to leave, and emotionally anchored to the bond, their nervous system can relax. That certainty allows them to control distance without fearing loss. It lets them pull back, slow down, or disengage temporarily, while assuming the connection will still be there when they return. For a long time, that certainty existed. Your consistency, patience, and emotional availability communicated something they relied on. They won't leave, not because you said it out loud, but because your behavior reinforced it. You stayed through ambiguity, you tolerated emotional gaps, you made room for their pace. From their perspective, investment equaled safety. Then your independence became visible, not as detachment, not as withdrawal, but as self-sufficiency. You began filling your life with meaning that didn't revolve around the relationship. Your sense of purpose expanded. Your emotional stability no longer rose and fell with their level of availability. And that shift introduced uncertainty they didn't know how to manage. Not because you threatened to leave, but because you could. And more importantly, because you would be okay if you did. That's the part that feels unpredictable to an avoidant nervous system. Your independence removes the guarantee that the connection exists by default. It introduces the possibility that you are choosing the relationship rather than clinging to it. And choice destabilizes dynamics that are built on emotional control rather than mutual regulation. This is the shift most people misunderstand. You're no longer bonded through anxiety, through fear of loss, fear of abandonment, fear of being alone. You're bonded through choice. You stay because the connection adds to your life, not because it stabilizes your identity. You engage because you want to, not because you need reassurance to feel whole. And that kind of bond feels dangerous to someone who survives through emotional control. Control doesn't always look like manipulation. Often it's subtle. It's knowing that distance will create longing. It's assuming silence will provoke outreach. It's trusting that inconsistency will keep someone invested. Those strategies only work when the other person is emotionally dependent on the bond to feel secure. Your independence breaks that loop. Now, distance doesn't guarantee pursuit. Silence doesn't guarantee anxiety. Pulling back doesn't guarantee power. Your independence introduces an unknown variable, your agency. And agency is unpredictable to someone who relies on predictable attachment dynamics to feel safe. This is why avoidants often feel unsettled, not when someone leaves, but when someone stays without needing them. When your presence is no longer driven by fear, they can't assume the bond will survive on autopilot. They have to confront the reality that connection now requires mutual investment. And mutual investment feels risky. It means showing up emotionally. It means engaging with vulnerability rather than retreating into distance. It means choosing connection without the buffer of control. Your independence quietly raises the stakes of the relationship without saying a word. That's why your independence doesn't read as confidence to them at first. It reads as unpredictability, because now they can't tell whether you'll wait, walk, or move forward on your own path. They can't assume your loyalty will override your self-respect. They can't rely on old patterns to anchor the bond. You didn't become less loving. You became less attached to outcomes that require self-abandonment. And that forces an avoidant to face a truth they'd rather not examine. Connection without control requires growth. Your independence doesn't push them away. It simply removes the illusion that they were ever in control of whether you stayed. And that uncertainty is what makes you feel unpredictable. Now, they don't know how to respond when love isn't being performed. Avoidants are accustomed to love being visible, expressive, and constantly proving itself. In their experience, love shows up through effort, reassurance, pursuit, and emotional availability that can be measured. When love is performed, it creates clarity for them. They know where they stand. They know how invested the other person is. And that visibility gives them a sense of control over closeness. They can lean in or pull back while still feeling secure in the bond. For a long time, your love looked like that. You expressed openly. You reassured consistently. You showed care in ways that were easy to read. Your affection was accessible, responsive, and outward facing. From the outside, this looked like devotion to an avoidant nervous system. It also meant predictability. They could feel connected without having to fully show up themselves. Then something changed. Your love became quieter, not withdrawn, just less performative. You stopped narrating your feelings. You stopped proving your loyalty through emotional labor. You stopped demonstrating care in ways that cost you peace. Your love didn't disappear. It rooted itself, more self-contained, more grounded, more anchored in self-respect.
You're no longer auditioning for reassurance.
That's the shift they don't know how to interpret. When love is no longer constantly expressed, it no longer functions as a guarantee. When affection isn't repeatedly displayed, it can't be assumed. And when presence isn't endlessly flexible, it stops being negotiable. This is where unpredictability enters the dynamic. Your affection is no longer guaranteed, not because you're withholding, but because it now depends on reciprocity. Your warmth isn't automatic. Your emotional availability isn't unconditional. It flows where there is mutual engagement rather than silent distance. Your presence is no longer negotiable. You don't stay simply because you always have. You don't rearrange yourself to maintain access. You don't tolerate emotional ambiguity just to keep the connection alive. Your presence now has weight because it has boundaries, and your energy has become selective. You invest where there is emotional safety. You give where there is effort. You remain open, but not at the expense of yourself. This selectivity is deeply confusing for an avoidant because it removes the assumption that love will continue regardless of how little they offer. This is why they may feel unsettled rather than relieved. When love isn't being performed, they can't rely on familiar cues to orient themselves. They can't tell how much you care based on intensity. They can't measure your commitment through sacrifice. They can't regulate closeness by withdrawing and waiting for you to reappear emotionally. Your love now exists without spectacle, and love without performance requires presence. That's the part that challenges them, because performance allows distance. It allows one person to feel loved without fully engaging. Rooted love, on the other hand, invites reciprocity. It asks both people to meet each other without roles, without scripts, without emotional labor filling the gaps. This isn't coldness. It's not punishment. It's not withdrawal. It's not indifference. It's self-respect. You didn't stop loving them. You stopped losing yourself to prove it. And when love is no longer performed, it becomes something they have to show up for or risk losing.
They didn't realize you were powerful until you stopped needing certainty from them.
For a long time, your strength went unnoticed because it was expressed through effort. You waited patiently. You explained yourself carefully. You held hope even when clarity was missing. From the outside, this looked like loyalty. But inside the dynamic, it also made your power invisible. When someone is always available, always willing to clarify, always hoping the other person will meet them halfway, their strength is mistaken for endurance rather than sovereignty. The moment you stopped needing certainty, everything changed. Your unpredictability is not emotional volatility. It isn't inconsistency. It isn't confusion. What they're sensing now isn't chaos, it's autonomy. You no longer move in response to their distance. You no longer need reassurance to stabilize your emotions. You no longer wait for clarity to give yourself permission to live fully. It's not instability, it's sovereignty. You shifted internally in ways that are subtle but profound. You moved from waiting to choosing. Waiting keeps your life paused, dependent on someone else's readiness. Choosing puts you back in motion. You decide how close you want to be. You decide what you tolerate. You decide what aligns with your values rather than what preserves the connection at all costs.
You also moved from explaining to observing. Explaining is an attempt to be understood. Observing is a sign that you understand yourself. You no longer need to narrate your feelings to be validated. You watch behavior, you notice patterns, You let actions speak, and that quiet discernment removes the emotional tug of war that once defined the dynamic.
And perhaps most importantly, you moved from hoping to grounding. Hope kept you emotionally suspended, always anticipating a future version of the relationship. Grounding brings you into the present. You respond to what is not what could be. You build stability inside yourself rather than waiting for someone else to provide it. These shifts are invisible to most people, but not to an avoidant, because suddenly their distance doesn't shape you anymore. Silence doesn't unsettle you. Pulling back doesn't provoke anxiety. You don't collapse inward or reach outward when they disengage. You remain steady, and that steadiness reveals something they weren't prepared to see. You are no longer organized around their availability. You are organized around yourself. That's the moment the power dynamic dissolves. When your emotional state is no longer responsive to their closeness or distance, control loses its function, not because you challenged it, but because you outgrew it. The relationship stops being regulated by avoidance and starts being defined by mutual presence. This is where respect enters the picture. Avoidance may not always know how to express it, but they feel it. Power that doesn't demand attention, doesn't seek validation, and doesn't react impulsively is deeply impactful. It doesn't chase, it doesn't withdraw to provoke, it simply exists. And that kind of power can't be managed. It can't be negotiated through distance. It can't be subdued through silence. It can't be stabilized through control. It can only be respected. You didn't become unpredictable because you lost yourself. You became unpredictable because you found yourself. And once someone is shaped by their own center rather than someone else's behavior, the dynamic is never the same again.